This is Tandy, the Atari Games podcast.
Its purpose is not just to give stuff away, but its purpose is to really make sure that if it's given away, it's going to be given to people and organizations who can make some impact with it. A thing behind closed doors in Washington in which we had an entire group of senators and congressmen for a period of about a day to learn about all this stuff.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit Podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Ted Kahn was creator of the Atari Institute for Educational Action Research, which awarded major grants of Atari home computer products and consulting services to individuals, schools, and nonprofit organizations. The group granted more than $1.25 million in products and services to about 100 innovative people and projects around the U.S. and overseas. Ted also co-wrote the books Atari Games and Recreations and Atari Pilot Activities and Games. This interview took place on October 9, 2015. In it, we discussed Ted's brother, Bob Kahn, and Tandy Trower, both of whom I have previously interviewed.
I was in the middle of a PhD in psychology at UC Berkeley. I had actually reached the point where my research was pretty much done. I did my research at Xerox PARC in the 1970s with Alan Kay and the group that developed the first personal computer. So at that point, my funding had run out from being a graduate teaching assistant, and my coursework was all done. I just basically hadn't finished writing my dissertation. So I was in need of a job and started pursuing other avenues. There's a key guy here in the Bay Area who was related to a whole bunch of different things in the personal computer industry named Bob Albrecht, and I don't know whether his name has come up in any of the other interviews, but was kind of a connector for a whole bunch of people. So he actually is an old friend of mine and was my brother's first teacher of the first programming he ever did back in Denver, and so he said, you might want to talk to some people at Atari. So I only knew about Atari as the video games company, and didn't know much more about it than that. So that's how it happened. I actually got an interview with Peter Rosenthal, who had just been recently hired to head up marketing for the consumer electronics division for what was going to become the personal computer division. And it kind of went from there. So it was late 1978, early 1979.
So I know that your brother Bob ended up working at Atari too, so it sounds like you were there first.
I was. I brought him and a number of other people in. We'd all been together back at the Lawrence Hall of Science, but there were some friends of mine from grad school and from those days who also ended up working for Bob once he got hired to do what he did. So I was a consultant first. I was not an employee. I was the first consultant Peter ever hired as a consultant. He was working for a guy named Don Kingsborough, who turned out to be one of the most successful distributors of Atari consumer electronics stuff, and was a guy who did Teddy Ruxpin and a whole bunch of other consumer electronics things in the late 1970s. The point was to try to figure out, because it was an emerging new computer division, but it wasn't totally kind of settled at that point. The product hadn't been released yet. It was being shown at the Consumer Electronics Show, I think actually in 1979 for the first time. And the question was what to do about it for education. So that's why I was hired. I was actually in that role as a consultant for 2 years until I finally became an employee.
So you were a consultant specifically trying to figure out how to make computers be useful in education?
Not so much useful. It was the useful part I knew all about already, because I'd actually been doing, at least I thought I knew about that, although it was a little bit different from the days. But it was more of a question of if this was going to be a business opportunity for a company like Atari that was going to be, basically combating, at that point, the only other major competitor was Apple, Radio Shack, and Commodore. And these were all very, very early things. It was called What's the Strategy, and what are we actually going to do with this? Peter was a really interesting, an incredible first boss to ever have, in a role like this, because he actually came from academia, but his family were the founders of Warner Communications. So they actually were people back at headquarters in New York, but he had a PhD in molecular biology from MIT and actually had done cancer research. And so he completely understood an academic side of me, I think, that other people never would have. And also the fact that I'd come out of a very advanced R&D kind of environment. So had I actually come into Atari with a different person and been reporting to people that were directly much more the marketing types without any of this, I'm not sure I ever would have been able to have made the impact that I did at all. So that was an important part of the story. It took about a year and a half for us to begin to develop a staff around all of this. And so a major part of the stuff in 1979 and 1980 was mostly going to consumer electronics shows, in Las Vegas and Chicago, kind of getting some sense of what people were interested in doing. And then I started advising the company on strategy, serious strategy, by 1980-81 about what to do with all of this. I had some very big differences of opinion at that point between the head of the company, Ray Kassar, and what I thought we should be doing, but I'll tell you about that in a second. So it led eventually to my founding an institute at Atari, and that's really the key story of how I became an employee there and how I kind of had a central role in the education thing by 1981.
So tell me how it got started, the Atari Institute for Educational Action Research.
Well, it's very simple. Every company in those days got hit up by everybody for donations. It was a pretty standard deal. Apple started doing this around the same time. I can't remember if it's exactly the same year or not, but they were putting an Apple II in every classroom in America. That was, I guess, either Steve Jobs' idea or it was somebody else, in the company. And they'd actually founded a foundation that was going to be doing something like this. In fact, I was actually recruited by somebody at Apple at a show in Europe to come join them, but I had just accepted this offer from a subsidiary of Warner Communications, and at that point, Apple was a very young company, et cetera, and it was kind of like if I looked at the combination of the two of those from some logical point of view, bad move on my part eventually, but a very good move from my part at that time.
That makes sense. I mean, Warner Communications versus this little startup.
Well, you know the story, so it's called David and Goliath. But anyway, what happened was that we kept getting requests. The division kept getting requests to donate computers. By then, we were actually shipping stuff, so this is 1981. There was a very important person at some point that you should probably talk to. His name is Dennis Groth. Dennis was the executive vice president of Atari at the time, went on to leave to found one of the most successful wineries in Sonoma called Groth Vineyards. And he was the person who had been approached by a number of different people to give, contributions of Atari computers. And the biggest one of all came from a children's museum in Washington, D.C. in 1981 called the Capitol Children's Museum. They not only wanted a lot of computers, but they were going to put together a major communications exhibit. And because of where their location was, which is Washington, D.C., where all kinds of ambassadors from international places, senators, congressmen, and other people, tended to bring their kids, it was a pretty high visibility thing. So Dennis got this request and didn't know what to do with it. Basically called me in to his office and said, "What do you think we should do?" And I said, "I think you should definitely do this donation, but I think more than that, this is not going to be the last time we get hit up by this. In fact, we're going to get requests all over the place, especially given what Apple has now done." So he again said, "So what do you think we should do?" And I said, "I think you should found an institute or some kind of a program that's got some organized strategy." And he said, "Go tell me what to do and get back to me." So this is 2 months before my statute of limitations had run out on my dissertation, meaning that if I hadn't finished it and filed it, I'd never get my PhD. It was also about the same time I proposed to my wife to get married. And so within less than 1 month's time, I had what I called the volcanic theory of change. I just wrote up, I'd never written a business plan in my life. I'd never written, an organizational plan for anything like this. So I wrote up what I thought we should do. Said we should start an institute. Whether we decide to make it a nonprofit or not, depends on how the corporation feels about all this. Its purpose is not just to give stuff away, but its purpose is to really make sure that if it's given away, it's going to be given to people and organizations who can make some impact with it, but it shouldn't be limited to big universities or big museums. We can give to individuals, we can give to, other programs, et cetera. So I filed that. It had a board of advisors, who I'll tell you about in a second, which was a key part of it, as well as some people on the corporate staff, and it was accepted. And so literally about the same time I filed my dissertation, and right before I got my PhD and proposed to my wife, I was hired to become the director of the thing that I founded. So, and at that point, that's the first time I'd ever had a direct staff and all kinds of other things that I had to figure out fairly quickly in a big company like this. So I was only 32 when I did this, but it's called How You Get Used to Learning How to Do Things in the corporate world. And by then, Atari was quite successful. The sales were going up. The idea of the computer being a compatriot to all the video game, coin-operated games and consumer electronic game stuff was designed to become a big business. They actually eventually hired a president of that entire division named Roger Batisher, who was also a member of the executive board of this institute we founded. So we didn't actually set it up as a nonprofit foundation, and the reason was that we were pretty overt about the fact that we wanted to promote the use of our own product. And so rather than trying to separate this with a Chinese wall and say, we're doing this, but we're also doing it for the general benefit of humanity, et cetera, we were just pretty overt about it. So it was more like what you would call a corporate philanthropy, or a corporate marketing philanthropy organization whose purpose was definitely educational and somewhat altruistic, but was also designed to promote the product and try to do good things. So that was it. That was founded in May of 1981. That's when I became an employee, or by June, et cetera. And then the next thing is we started a program for the next 2 years of what to do with all this. And in parallel to this, at the same time, I'd actually encouraged the guy who was my former mentor, Alan Kay, through the president of Warner Communications, asking me what I thought about him, because he'd been recommended to him to hire him as Atari's chief scientist. So this happened almost at the same time. I think maybe it was about 4 or 5 months later. And then, of course, Alan built up a very huge R&D organization that included a lot of the other people whose names I sent you during that time. So we weren't part of that, but we were actually so close to it that, we were kind of compatriots in the next 2 years of doing that kind of work.
Well, I just thought it was interesting you were brought in interest as a consultant initially to help sell to schools, and then you ended up giving computers away to schools.
Yep. Well, the answer. Okay, so at this point there were two different things. There were other people that were being hired that Peter hired in order to kind of actually deal more directly with marketing things, because I had never done any kind of commercial marketing. My whole background had basically been in either academic or academic types of institutions. And I actually had a kind of a 5 to 10 year horizon or longer on this because of my whole work at Xerox PARC, et cetera, which was great from a research point of view, but not necessarily from a current marketing point of view. So there were other staff members that were brought in to the marketing department under Peter during the time I was a consultant. Two particular ones, a woman who I've lost touch with completely named Georgia Marzalak, and the other was a guy who ended up becoming one of the early employees of Microsoft, whose name was Tandy Trower.
I've interviewed him.
Yeah. Oh, great. So, okay, so then you know them. So these people and I think there were maybe one or two others, were Peter's core marketing staff during they were actually employees. I was a consultant, or maybe Tandy was a consultant and then became an employee. I can't remember, but around 1980 and 81. And there was another one also hired, who I'm sure you've probably heard about. His name was Brenda Laurel, and who became very famous in her own right long after this. She became part of Alan's group, but now, she's known all over the place for the work that she did in user interface stuff, etc. And then a bunch of young, very energetic people started being attracted to both the marketing side and to the research side. And that's kind of where we were at. We were in the middle of this. So we weren't just marketing, and we weren't just pure research. And education, as far as I was concerned, I didn't want the strategy of the company to just focus on schools. And unfortunately, that tends to be exactly what most companies do when they think about this, because I felt that most of what was going on was coming informally from the outside. And basically, there were no classes in most elementary or middle schools in the early 1980s to teach computer programming or anything like this. So the people who were learning it informally from being like hobbyists. I mean, they're like the kids are now. The reason I'm telling you this is because about the same time I was doing this, there were several board members who were part of the Atari Institute, and I'm going to list several of their names here so that you can look them up.
Appreciate that.
The key one was my mentor, who later I became a part of his company, who's no longer alive, named Dean Brown, who had founded the first educational technology lab at SRI in the 1960s and 70s. Herb Cole was a major open educator who was known all over the world for the books he wrote, including 36 Children and other stuff in the 1960s and 70s. And I'm mentioning him here, and then I'll give you the rest, because he and I, thanks to Albrecht, wrote 3 books together around this same time, and they were targeted at getting people to learn how to use these computers without having to take classes of any kind. So we basically put in code for you to develop your own games and recreations by writing basic programs, which is the language that everybody, yep, that's it. That was my book. Amazing that you have a copy of that. So I'm going to tell you the story of this one because it actually tells something of...
First of all, we're talking about Atari Games and Recreations.
Right. And there was another one I wrote with him and a guy named Dale Dishroon about Pilot. Pilot was actually a project my brother took over as being the product manager, but it was an alternative language to BASIC that was designed to incorporate something that Seymour Papert had developed called Turtle Graphics and some other things, so that very, very young kids and other people could be writing programs in a matter of minutes that actually had interactive stuff going on the screen. So Herb and I wrote this book with 2 other people. It became a bestseller. Over 50,000 copies were actually sold in less than a year and a half. And the reason was not because it was the only, cool thing in the market, but it turns out the largest school system in the world from the U.S. was the DoD Overseas Schools. It's the Department of Defense school system. And there was someone in Germany who had actually found out about the Atari. Several people on our board were really, people who've been involved in education and computing for years and realized we had a very advanced architecture far beyond Apple and a number of others, and we're quite excited about all this. And so the way they make decisions in the Department of Defense and hierarchically is if you decide some major part of this decides to adopt something like this, it's not just a simple 1 or 2 things. It's like an entire country. And there were no curriculum materials at all about how to use, this computer. So when this guy at the DoD in Germany decided that he wanted Atari computers for the DoD schools over there, this was the only book around at that time that actually had anything to do with what are you going to do with this. And so what we discovered literally in less than 6 to 12 months is that we'd sold 50,000 copies of it.
Wow. So basically to one guy.
Well, through that network, and then of course, but that's an important part of what I'm trying to talk about in terms of strategy, because I came out of an environment that really wasn't formal K-12 classrooms. I came out of a museum, into all of this, and so my whole kind of orientation was stuff that isn't in classrooms that can become kind of an adjunct to classroom stuff. I mean, the first kids I ever taught computing to were underprivileged kids from Emeryville, in a very, very low-well situation, who happened to come up to the Lawrence Hall once a week because they were part of a gifted and talented program. But I didn't teach in Emeryville. I taught at the Lawrence Hall in an environment that was much more informal. And the thing that I noticed from the 1970s that was where Albrecht's whole focus is that everything was not so much in schools, but rather in informal places, like people would get together and play computer games and do Greek dancing or something, in an evening. Or, you'd have a museum like ours, because we were the first museum in the world to ever do this, where people would come and learn about computers as part of coming up to a science museum. And the home, which was really Atari's key market for everything except for the coin-operated games that they'd put in the arcades, was actually the place that this computer was really supposed to go. It was called the Atari home computer in the beginning. It was not called the Atari personal computer. And so when the strategy came out about what to do about education, I actually felt we'd be a lot better off leveraging that whole strategy. That's exactly what my brother did, too, when he ended up doing, these camps, these, computer camps and the stuff at Club Med and all the rest of it. It wasn't in schools. It was actually in other places that are, quote, what we would call recreational learning. The company decided, and this was mostly, I think, Ray Kassar's decision along with some other people, that from a strategy point of view, they'd be better off hooking up with some organization that really knew how to sell to education. So they chose a subsidiary of IBM. It was called SRA Associates. It was a subsidiary in Chicago. They had been owned by IBM for years. The entire approach was very, very IBM oriented. And it was kind of like at that point, the company decided to turn over the whole educational strategy about selling to schools to this organization. I felt it was a very big mistake because it was kind of like, if they don't succeed, and I had some suspicions that this could be really problematic based on what I knew from some IBM stuff, we were going to lose the market. And Apple at the same time was highly competing in this market and really strongly pushing into education. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. In less than 2 years, they really hadn't done almost anything. And then by the end of 1982 and 83,
Apple had won.
Things had begun to go to the point where, the company was about to go under. So in addition to some of the people I mentioned here, let me mention some other people who are on the board of advisors of the Institute, because this is kind of interesting. This woman came to us through Herb. She's the founder of the Children's Defense Fund. She's an extremely well-known person all over the country. She's known by governments, et cetera. She came from Herb because Herb knew her. In addition to that, we had a couple of luminary names. I don't know if this name you'll remember at all.
You need to say them as well as type them, because
yes. So Barry and I write Edelman. Hugh Downs was the former host of the Tonight Show years ago for many, many years. He and Barbara Walters.
I was going to say, like Hugh Downs and Barbara Walters, like that Hugh Downs.
That's the one. That's the one. So he was another one. This one you would never expect. This is Judy Collins, as in, the famous folk singer, pop singer, etc. The reason for these people were the Warner connections. So Judy Collins recorded for Warner Electra Asylum Records. The Ray Kassar and a couple of people at the top of Atari felt we needed some people, names on this board, who had some public recognition, etc. She's a very fascinating woman, and she never really got deeply involved in all this, but got really interested in video disc stuff in the early days, etc. And so we actually had a private dinner with her in San Francisco after a concert with a whole bunch of other people, including the head of Warner's, division that does Superman, Batman, and all the rest of those kinds of comics, etc. So the Warner empire, the entertainment empire, and this is the reason I thought this was going to be so successful, was so powerful in terms of its spread. I mean, we're seeing all of it now, like 40 years later, with all the the movies and blockbuster things that are based on comics, etc. But in those days, we hadn't mined any of this. So this was kind of the way to begin to get into that world. There's another guy named Sam Gibbon. Sam was at Bank Street College and had probably done the most interesting work for kids in video disc stuff and interactive interactive education. Bank Street's a very advanced kind of I don't know, an avant-garde kind of an education school in New York that does incredible stuff. In addition to that, let me see if I can remember. Oh, this guy, Heinz von Forster, was one of the founders of the field of cybernetics, one of the most interesting people I've ever met in my life, became a very, very close friend of mine. And he was brought in by this guy, Paul Trackman, who was an editor at Smithsonian. So I don't have the entire list, but I'm pretty close. No, yeah, there were a couple of other people who came in, to Atari as not parts of the Institute, but Alan Alda was one of them.
Sure.
Another one is that we once had.
He won't talk to me. His people won't let him talk to me.
That's really unfortunate. But Alan probably won't remember all that much about the Atari stuff because he wasn't involved for that long. But it's really unfortunate because what he eventually ended up becoming really interested in doing and did with all these science programs is exactly what, had we survived, et cetera, this could have eventually turned into to exactly the kind of stuff I would have loved, because television and media are informal things. The other one was we had lunch with Douglas Adams, as in The Hitchhiker's Guide. So all. Just a second. My wife is giving me hints. Who else? Yeah. So a lot of these people ended up finding their way into the corporate dining room of Atari. In those days, I'd never heard of such a thing. So that's part of the history of who kept flowing their way through this. Let me see if I've got everybody else.
So these people were on the board, or just
these are all advisors. Mm-hmm. And this was really an important part of the Institute because just taking a bunch of requests for giving computers away and not having a group of people kind of think about what it was that we really wanted to do with them and whether there was a program would have made us just like anybody else who basically is kind of like a foundation gets hit up for $100 and $500 donations. I just felt that wasn't the most appropriate way to do things. So we spread our donations out between large institutions. So there were divisions of Stanford and some particular things. There was a nursery school there called Bing School where my younger son actually went to preschool, and they were involved at the same time with the Learning Company, which is where my wife was a founder, and that software, since it ran on the Atari computer and also the rest of it, was very appropriate for kids who were there. So sometimes we made these decisions based on individual people who were involved and kind of what they were doing. Sometimes it was in the case of the Capitol Children's Museum, the reason that became so important was its visibility. So it was kind of like the flagship donation that started this entire program. There were people as famous as Al Gore and just a second, names of famous broadcasters.
Dan Rather.
Yes, that's him. So Dan Rather ended up coming to the Capitol Children's Museum for the opening of this entire thing. And there were ambassadors and other people from different countries who brought their kids here. So it clearly had a lot of high visibility. The other key person in this entire thing at this time had become an incredibly close friend of mine, and that's Steve Mayer. Steve had actually started doing stuff with personal computers in non-traditional places around the same time I got hired. That's how I met him. He was actually helping Sesame Street put computers into a place called Sesame Place, which was kind of a thing in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where kids could go to a theme park that was related to the Sesame Street characters, et cetera. And there were a whole bunch of computers. It turns out the initial ones were Apples that were there. But because Steve was an advisor to all these kinds of things, we got connected through a woman who had taken over the project at the Lawrence Hall from my brother. Her name is Joyce Hackinson. And she had later then gone on to Children's Television Workshop to develop software there. So Steve became, along with Peter and Dennis Groth, but probably more Steve than anybody, the connecting point that I had for all kinds of things that were going on during this time. And he and I went to Washington several times together to actually look at what was going on with these exhibits. And then there were testimonies by all kinds of other people in Congress. In those days, Al Gore was a very young, senator, et cetera, but there were science and technology, committee hearings going on. There was a huge movement of a lot of very, very famous people to Paris at around this time to found a world center for computers and, the information, leapfrogging the information age for underdeveloped countries that included tons of people from the MIT Media Lab, et cetera. So we used to attend these hearings, et cetera. And I'm going to give you the one story of kind of what I think is so powerful about what we did with the Children's Museum and its impact on the government, because it all came from this one grant. Very few people in Washington, in the Congress, in 1980 or 81 or even 82, had ever used a personal computer at all. Almost no senators, almost no congressmen. In fact, a lot of them didn't even type. So almost everybody who ever did any of this turned their stuff over to secretaries to do this on electric typewriters. And it became pretty apparent that this was going to become a fairly big deal, and a lot of these people didn't want to be embarrassed about how little they knew about all this. So Peter Hirschberg at the Children's Museum set up a thing behind closed doors in Washington in which we had an entire group of senators and congressmen for a period of about a day to learn about all this stuff in an engaging way. But it was the Children's Museum and Atari who basically set up the agenda for this. And I'll never forget this. You can ask Peter. I may be able to connect you to him. It was really a fun story. Is that there was an early version of Excel that was called VisiCalc back in the 1970s. It was a spreadsheet.
Sure.
So Peter ended up simulating the Social Security system and its assets over a period of 10, 20, and 30 years. Did it in VisiCalc and proceeded to show people in 1980 or 81 that this entire system was in deep trouble. 20 to 30 years by actually simulating the entire thing on a large screen, with a piece of software. And I actually will never forget this. I was sitting next to Claiborne Pell, who was a senator, I believe, from Rhode Island when I was there, and he was learning about something called Lexis, which was an online system, information search system for legal stuff, et cetera. He had never seen that before. So you can kind of imagine this environment. I mean, this is all taking place. These people didn't want, the press there and all the rest of it. And part of it was because it would end up showing, it could have been a great press event, but it would end up showing how little anybody knew about any of this stuff. So that's an example of the kind of thing that came out of the work that we did together. So.
Nice. Well, I was going to ask about you said you set out to donate computers where they would have the biggest impact. And so you've mentioned a couple. And
another very, very big project in those days was that very few schools had enough computers to do anything of substance because they were brand new. They were more expensive relative to 1980 and 81 than they are now. So rather than, setting up permanent labs of some of these, we did that in 2 or 3 cases. We actually put a whole bunch of computers into a mobile van. That was developed by Alcorn's group. There was a guy named Harry, whose last name I'm blanking on, who was the main architect of this. They actually constructed easily removable carts that could be pulled out of an entire van and basically rolled into a classroom in 1981 or 82 in less than 20 minutes, so that you could actually then hook them all up and move it like a bookmobile from place to place. It was co-sponsored by a nonprofit here in the Bay Area called the Industry Education Council and had the backing of computer-using educators, which was kind of the emerging social group of the late 70s and early 80s that had a lot of people interested in this. It was probably the most visible thing that we had here in the Bay Area. It had Atari's logo on it. It drove around to schools all over the place. I don't know how many thousands of kids probably got their first introduction to personal computers as a result of this mobile van.
I was aware in Napa Valley there was a bus filled with Atari computers. Is that separate from
That's could have been very, very similar. If it was in Napa Valley, there was another woman named Liza Loop who did a lot of stuff up closer to, I think that area, Napa and Santa Rosa, because she'd run a center, a nonprofit center. She'd actually also been a consultant at Atari, and she's actually trying to document an awful lot of this stuff of what happened in the early days of computers and learning through a virtual museum that she's created. I'll have to see if I can find the link for you, and you can take a look.
I've talked to her and familiar with the Loop Center.
Okay, great. There was another guy like that up in Marin County named David Fox, and he's still around too. He and I don't know if he's still married to her, but his wife Annie Fox were both doing something similar to what we did at the Lawrence Hall of Science, but in a smaller way. So what started to happen is some very, very big institutions like, University of California, Lawrence Hall of Science started to spawn little kind of replicas in a small community center environment of these things. And then some of them ended up in libraries. That was another place I gave donations, which was I gave stuff to the Dallas Public Library, where my uncle actually was an adult curator there, and some other places, because in those days, that was one of the places where people would come, and get information. And it was also an obvious connection to what was going to become the information age, which is that you can also learn about personal computers there. So that was the beginning of that thing. So museums, libraries, community centers, major things within universities. Some of them turned out, a couple of the grants we gave were specifically targeted to kids with disadvantages and disabilities. There was a major one that was done through Johns Hopkins, and it's the same kind of thing we're finding now. Some of the most innovative interface stuff that we've done that's available for the public has come because it needed to be developed for people who have real serious disabilities. I mean, think Stephen Hawking and folks like this and things like that. The other major public event that we co-sponsored in 1982 and 83 was a conference on video games and their benefits at Harvard Graduate School of Education. You can kind of fast forward 30 or 40 years now and see that now serious games and all the rest of this is a very big deal, but in those days it was really contentious. One of the things I had to do when I was the director of this institute is I actually needed to have training to actually give public presentations to people, because there was a lot of back push about negative stuff about video games, even in the early 1980s. And a lot of these games in those days, I mean, they were nowhere near as violent or certainly not as graphic or anything as we have now. But it was called How to Present a Positive Case for This. So there were a group of us who all, including my wife and several other people. There was another vice president in those days whose name is Conrad Judson, who I remember specifically. And then Herb Cole had helped us get this together, because he was a graduate of Harvard University, got us to the head of the Graduate School of Education in those days, who's no longer alive. Her name is Annabeth Miller. And we sponsored a 2-day conference on video games and human development at Harvard. And it included people who later became incredibly famous. The guy whose, whole theory of multiple intelligences, Howard Gardner, gave one of the keynote addresses there. This is 1981, 82. All these people from different parts of the country, came together to this conference. And some of them were fascinating. I mean, there were people who were using video games in those days for stroke victims, which now it turns out, that's something that's much, much more common. Now, it's for the recovery of certain, both mental and also physical, kinds of abilities. So it was those were the public kind of things that we did. We hosted a couple of conferences in different places to introduce people to this whole idea, that included kids. And that's probably the other key thing that we did, is that we actually brought in teenagers as advisors to Atari, specifically because they were really bright. Probably the most visible 2 projects I have included an animation program, and you should definitely talk to this guy. His name is Dave Master. He ran an animation program at a high school, a low-wealth high school in Los Angeles, that became world famous because the number of people who ended up in the industry and ended up doing award-winning films who came out of this one high school was larger than anything else outside of maybe Cal Arts. And so that became not only one of our most important grants, but I think it was the first example of how you take something like this. It's not about teaching you a specific subject, but rather being a tool for people who are trying to do things. And they immediately made use of the computers that we had and started doing things that nobody, even in the industry, could believe had happened. And he continued to do that for years, later became the head of training for Warner Brothers' new feature studio, animation studio, and then developed a whole global network that actually allowed people to learn about animation, through these things. So then the other key person was a very low wealth center in the barrio in Austin, Texas. Mm-hmm. It was called the Center for Development of Non-Formal Education. The woman's name is Emily Vargas Barone, and she later became the deputy director of USAID under the Clinton administration for human development, human capacity development worldwide. So this is, again, a community center in a place. It's not a school. It was a community thing specifically for parents and for very young kids of Latino families in a very, very low wealth area in Austin, in which she incorporated computers and other things very, very easily. She'd known about this stuff because she and Dean Brown had actually been colleagues together back in the late 80s or late 60s and 70s through UNESCO stuff, et cetera. So it wasn't a random thing that we just happened to give it to some, project in a barrio. We gave it to a project where the person knew so much from having history of all this and also had a philosophy of really knowing what to do with it. And, again, for many of these people, these were the first computers they ever had, mm-hmm. the first personal computers they ever had. So it became kind of the starting place for that. Wow. So I think that hits most of some of the top projects and some of the people.
I noticed that when the Institute was originally announced, it said that grants totaling $250,000 in cash and equipment will be given in the first year.
There's a lot more than that.
And it ended up being
by the time
almost $1.5 million, I think.
That's correct. So we were very, very, 1981, though, $250,000 was a substantial amount, but nothing near, I guess the scope of what you would consider happening now. But
was there pushback from Atari corporate going, you're giving away too much money, or were they?
Not at all, actually. For 2 years, that almost never happened. Because also you have to remember the kind of mentality, and this mentality was also partially responsible, I think, for the downfall of what happened to Atari in 83 and 84. Warner considered Atari to be one of its most profitable subsidiaries by 1981 and 82. 82, 83 is the key apocryphal story of what happened, during that Christmas time. But money was being put. The amount of money that we actually had for the Institute was like an insignificant amount compared to the amount of advertising, broadcast advertising on television, other kind of advertising. Now, if you look at the video games side of the business as opposed to just the personal computer side of the business, this was nothing, compared to the amount of money they spent. I also realized, and this was part of, I don't know whether this should be part of the podcast or not, but when we flew back to the conference at Harvard, we were flown in the corporate jet. There were a group of us, about 6 or 8 of us, who are part of the cohort who actually started this conference and did all of it, et cetera. And actually, Linda Gordon, who's now Linda Brownstein, and somebody I want you to talk to too, I think was part of that group as well. And I hadn't realized how often this corporate jet was kind of going back and forth between, East Coast and West Coast, because Atari were so well connected. And I just happened to ask, the pilot afterwards, because we all had a catered lunch and the rest, and then it basically landed on a private airfield, and then ended up having a limousine chauffeuring us to Harvard. You can kind of get the idea. This is very typical of Google and everybody else then, but for me, at the age of 32, 33, it was kind of like, this is interesting. So I wondered how much that cost, just for the lunch or something. I don't remember the number, but I was astonished after that, and I did some quick calculations in my head and said, if this is going on an average of every week or 2 weeks, and we're in this current position, I wonder how long this can last. And of course, you probably know the story, the apocryphal story of what happened in December, in January of 82, 83. So,
you're talking about the ET debacle?
Yes, the thing that they have now finally found, the remnants of what was considered to be an urban legend. Right. So there are archaeologists, I call them that, who have actually found the buried cartridges under the sands of New Mexico, wherever they are.
You had said before that Atari had kind of handed over to SRA the job of getting apples into the schools. And we all know what happened I'm sorry, getting Atari machines into the schools. And
Well, no, but it was in parallel to getting apples into the schools.
right,
So
but Apple won totally won in the education market. And you said
right.
you would have done it differently. And I'm curious, what would you have done if you were in charge of getting Ataris into the schools?
Well, I did but the point was that it didn't survive. So this institute was designed not to just be a donations vehicle. It was designed to become a basis for the corporate strategy over 3 to 5 years of rethinking how to do marketing and how to actually take advantage of the innovation of what people who are getting these computers were doing. So it's not just about giving them away. It's about what do people produce. It's a circulatory system. And the problem in most kind of marketing ventures, and this is still true even now on the web, is you put out the message with the assumption that you know what you want people to do, but you don't incorporate, like we now do from the social web, what people are telling you they actually do, and then take advantage of it, and then, build on it. So the whole notion of a personal computer wasn't just that it's a delivery mechanism, it's a creation mechanism. And it's a content creation mechanism that's, even larger than, a camera. Like when you sell cameras to the public, you expect them to take pictures with it. And of course, the whole industry of what people do with the camera is far more important than the physical thing of itself. And I felt that the whole strategy that Atari had actually adopted was so much more directed towards using it to teach things, that's the whole SRA kind of approach, than it was to enable people to create things. And if I look at the whole, range of all the different kinds of people, and there was one other, there's one other important project I didn't mention. This was where my brother went to high school. George Washington High School in Denver was the first high school anywhere in the world to ever teach programming to anybody who were kids in high school. This is 1962. This is where my brother went to school. There was a guy there who's now in his 80s named Dr. Erwin Hoffman, and he had applied because he knew about me, and also because I used to be his tennis coach when I was a teenager back in Denver, for a grant. And we gave him, he was one of the 3 or 4 really large installations of labs of computers that we gave. And so we held our second to last board meeting at his high school, brought our entire board of advisors there to see what he and his kids had done. And his entire approach to the whole thing was much more what I'm talking about. It's called, if you give, and the same thing with Dave Master, if you give a set of equipment to a group of very creative kids and a teacher who really understands the power of what's done, it's not that they're going to typically use all this to just go buy software, from a commercial company. It's that the kids themselves are going to produce applications that are actually interesting or applications of that. And, he was one of the first winners of a presidential award, for mathematics teaching, et cetera, because he was a math teacher. But the way he taught in his school and the way he enabled his students was what these things were really all about from the power point of view. And there was one other, I just now remembered the one board member I didn't mention to you who came to me through Alan Kay, because Tim Galloway was with us there in Denver. He was the author of The Inner Game of Tennis. He's a famous guy who wrote about inner game of skiing, inner game of tennis, inner game of golf, all that kind of stuff. He actually gave all of us an inner game lesson on the tennis courts of the Broadmoor Hotel while we were there in Denver for this meeting. But everybody who came to this meeting spent their time talking to these kids. I mean, this is the kind of marketing we should have been doing. So as opposed to just a major single SWAT donation program and then hire 4 or 5 different companies or organizations to develop specific curriculum software on A, B, and C, the point was to enable a group of young people to become creators of their own. And really, to me, that was the whole reason I founded the Institute. It wasn't the other side of it. And unfortunately, the industry became dominated for the next 10 to 20 years by this other paradigm, which is
consuming rather than creating.
Yeah, I mean, the big money came from large curriculum, like Computer Curriculum Corporation and Plato and a lot of the rest. I'm not saying none of them were bad, because they're not, but their whole orientation was not to enable the creative capacity of people. Their intention was to teach something that wasn't being taught well, and that kids were getting disadvantaged by not having, enough educational resources. So.
Right. So it sounds like you're fundamentally at odds with your wife, who was at the learning company, which
No, quite the opposite. Not at odds at all, because their whole approach was not the same as these other companies. Their approach was actually a gaming, interactive kind of approach where kids learn about things through doing things, some of which you actually build more stuff. What most people don't realize is the two most innovative products of the learning company in the early days were something called Rocky's Boots,
Sure.
which was not a program that taught specifically logic design. You can't do that to 4, 5, and 6-year-olds. It enabled them to build things, with a tool that they actually learned digital logic by building stuff. Right. Same thing with the other one that came after it, which was called Robot Odyssey. So there were several programs in the early days of the learning company that were so different in terms of their orientation, because they took gaming or took interactive kind of fun into a direction that was not directly about take a whole bunch of curriculum that we've already got and do what we did with e-learning and with an awful lot of the stuff that's still there. So we weren't at odds at all. Actually, it was complementary, because the gaming stuff, which is what Atari's core competency was, later became a huge deal in education. But in those days, there was this big division saying games are for fun, right, and learning is serious.
We're going to write quiz applications that just do math on the screen or something. Right.
Yeah. So no, it was actually that part of it was they used to call us the bedroom connection of Silicon Valley, because he was at the learning company and I was at Atari, and this is how a whole bunch of people supposedly found out between the two of us what was going on.
Nice. I would like to talk to her separately if she has anything at all to say about Atari.
I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you. So yeah.
What'd you say?
No, she's in the background. She said she'd be happy to do it, just not now. We have my brother's daughter's getting married on Sunday, so we have a wedding this weekend.
I'd be honored.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, I'll set up something with her separately.
His career.
Oh yeah, that's another point. So a guy who's just come here this week, who's just written this incredible book on AI, the guy from the New York Times, John Markoff, started his career documenting the learning company and some other stuff in the early 1980s. So Frona met him when he was a very young reporter who wasn't known by just about anybody in those days. So here's a guy who's got a 35-year history, who's now like an award-winning guy, who's written kind of the best book in the world about artificial intelligence and robotics and all the rest. But that's where he started. And Mitch Kapoor was another one. He used to visit these companies. He was a meditator in those days with long hair, in the late 70s and 80s, and was really intrigued by what was going on at the learning company and some other places. So,
nice. All right, so you're trucking along, you're giving away computers and money and making an impact, and then how did it all come to an end?
Yeah, well, so we didn't end up giving away money. We gave away 3 things. We gave away hardware, software, and warmware. We didn't have a network in those days. Warmware is people connections. It's what we now call social media, or it's now what we call the community, online communities. There was almost no way to easily do that in those days, because we had 300 or 600 baud modems or 1,200 baud modems, and CompuServe was the only thing in 1981 or 82 that really enabled anybody to kind of sign up and get onto a network. AOL, of course, came very shortly after that. But it was connections to people who knew what to do with these technologies that we spent a lot of time talking to people about. So we didn't have any email in those days. We didn't have email. We didn't have other easy telecommunications stuff that could allow us to do these things. So what we had to do was informal connecting, which is the whole thing of the way the social media and social network stuff has developed anyway, by connecting people together. So sometimes it was done through conferences. A lot of times it was done by phone calls. It's just called, you need to talk to this person. This person has this grant from us too. If we'd had more money and more time, what we probably would have done, in those days there was no video that you could actually share with people, is that we would have easily, started distributing what people were doing to other people. But the problem was there was no network yet to allow us to do that. So we had to do it by very, very low-tech means. And that's, I think, the thing that I know about this community, because I've maintained connection with, I think, at least 10 or 20 of the people who got these computers. Many of them went on to become top people in their own fields, whether it was in education or whether it was in some other, aspect of things. These were some of the things that allowed them, to actually get their hands on something at an early stage. And it's not that Atari became, their only computer, because obviously it wasn't, but it became the vehicle, for them to do this. I finished my dissertation on an Atari computer. I had a word processor. I had nothing else I could do. I never would have finished if it hadn't been, for having that, in 1981, et cetera. But what ended up happening after our last meetings, we had a lot of strategy stuff about what we wanted to do. We wanted to try to leverage a lot of things for people who never would have had access to this at all. So the whole disadvantaged, population, the kinds of people that Marian Wright Edelman, spends her entire life kind of trying to support, et cetera, is where we would have been heading. And then in late 1982 and early 1983, the Christmas, demise basically happened, where the company went from $1 billion in sales. It was the first Silicon Valley company of its kind to ever hit that mark. Around 1981 to 82, and that by early 1983, we were headed for a $500 million loss in the first or second quarter of the year. It became really clear to me by that time that there were big problems. I already knew there were some internal problems, and I also knew that there were problems between communication between Atari and corporate headquarters in New York. This is one of the other things that happened for me. I was so young, I didn't kind of understand this, but I spent at least several meetings, in the office of the president of Warner Communications, talking, to people like Manny Gerard, who was one of the three co-presidents of Warner Communications, about what was going on. And it's because I was picking this stuff up by having watched kind of what was happening on our end and how little it seemed that Warner Communications really had an understanding of all this. By the time middle of 1983 happened, around May or April, Ray Kassar was gone. Dennis Groth had also resigned. Manny Gerard came in to run the company on behalf of Warner Communications for a period of time, because I think the shock to them of what was they considered to be like the jewel of their assets, in less than 6 months or 8 months had gone through this kind of a thing, was a pretty bad shift. And so by that summer, I was doing some international projects. The last project we ever did was a major exhibit that we co-sponsored in Israel at the Israel Museum. It was a design pavilion thing called From Pong to Home Computer. It was the first time people in Israel had actually ever seen this many different applications, et cetera. And by the time I came back from Israel from that exhibit, which was June or July, I realized I couldn't stay. I didn't think the company was going to survive. So I left in August and September of 1983. I got somebody else hired to take over from me who'd been a former program officer at the National Science Foundation, who I'd been kind of courting a relationship with, to try to develop some stuff that's now very, very common. I mean, NSF and the Department of Education have been doing stuff with educational technology now for 20 or 30 years. And so it didn't really survive after me. There were some other people who were part of my staff who went on to other, places around the country, et cetera. And I can, send you a list of some of their names, et cetera. But basically the whole thing by around fall of 1983 was really on its way out. And within 6 months after that, the company basically was closed down and then bought up by the people who started Commodore. So this is the transition thing.
You still have an Atari computer?
I do. I refuse to give it up. And actually, my friend Heinz von Forrester, until he died, continued to have his own Atari computer in the basement of his house that he always showed people. He said, "This is my favorite computer." And this is one of the founders of cybernetics, so it was kind of an honor. I can't get it to run on the disk drive anymore because the drive is so old and is so misaligned. I don't know anybody who knows how to align these, but the good news is that there are emulators that, as I understand now, you can run on Macs and anything else to run most of the rest of the software. The problem is getting the code off of the original disks that are floppies so that you can actually then run the emulators to run them. So
if you need help with that, I have a setup that can move data.
I actually would love to know about that because what's really fun about this, so I can kind of tell you from having had two kids who grew up with this, our older son actually played some of the games, that my wife developed at the Learning Company when he was young.
Nice.
But he couldn't do them on an Atari by then because so we actually had an Apple IIGS that he was playing with in his room.
Nice. I'm going to show you. This gadget is called SIO to SD, and it has an SD card in here and an SIO connector, and it just plugs into the Atari, and it thinks it's a disk drive.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Great. Well, and I would love to know if that's something that, if I have to build it like a maker thing, then that's fine. But that would be cool.
Yeah, you can build it. You can buy them for about $100, or if go ahead and do that.
Definitely send it to me because I still have my machine in the garage. The other thing I think about this, and I'm sure you know this from having talked to all the rest of them, what was really crazy about this crossover of having Commodore buy Atari is the reverse crossover that happened to the Commodore Amiga. Because clearly the Amiga was based on J. Miner's architecture, which was one of the key chips in the Atari that he had designed together, which became the basis for the Amiga. And fast forward about 6 years after this happened, I became a staff member for Digital Effects. Digital Effects was founded by my friend Steve Mayer, as a digital video company. And it turned out that the only desktop video editing that you could do in those days was on the Amiga.
Right, toaster. Right.
Totally, based on what the ultimate Atari would have become had we survived. The Atari they produced after that, the ST, et cetera, was a different machine, and obviously its architecture was quite different. But the brilliance of the stuff that Steve and Jay and other people had done eventually became Commodore, and then of course our stuff, became Atari. So.
Yeah, it was a crazy flip-flop. A lot of us in the community consider the Amiga the spiritual successor to the Atari 800, for sure.
Well, it actually was the thing that the Mac 2, or the Color Mac, was supposed to become, but then there was the corporate revolt inside of Apple. So part of that whole story of how Digital Effects got born is that my friend Steve Mayer was running another parallel R&D lab in New York at the same time that Alan was running the major corporate research at Atari. Its whole focus was on video, about turning video into something that was, manageable data of a particular kind. He was developing all kinds of advanced technologies, and his wife, Nico, who in those days was named Nancy, was developing all kinds of early childhood applications and games, because she'd come out of Harvard, and in Radcliffe, in a program that was very, targeted very similar to some stuff that Frona was interested in. And when that demised, in other words, when the entire corporate demise of Atari happened, that lab shut down too. Steve's work was going to be eventually targeted to what would become the Color Macintosh. And he was going to move the entire thing, over there so that it would become a video machine as well as this. But it turns out that didn't happen because Jobs got kicked out of Apple at the wrong time. So what happened was that eventually we had to wait another few years to do this, and the applications that we developed at Digital Effects that were around desktop digital editing around 89, 90 were actually preceded by the Amiga in its own kind of, like a Saab compared to the rest of the cars. It had become kind of the cult computer of the digital video set before we actually were able to do editing on a Macintosh. So that's it. That's pretty much the story. I think I covered almost everybody in the advisors group, most of the major projects, although there were lots of others, but I think those are the key people. So.
Nice. So yeah, is there anything I haven't asked you that I should have?
What would I have done differently?
Okay.
I don't know. This is a case of Silicon Valley logic versus what you would call paper logic. So there was this time or this chance that I had to actually move this whole orientation. Oh, I know. There was one other guy I didn't mention who's really important on my board of advisors. Carl Zinn was at the University of Michigan. The reason his name comes up is that he was also a member of the advisory board for the Apple Foundation, and there was one other guy too. Sorry, I now remember the last two. Sandy Wagner is founder of Q. So these two people had close associations with Apple and their education work at the same time, because computer using educators, since it grew out of Silicon Valley, it was any personal computers at all that could be used in education in the late 70s, early 80s, and that included only four companies, and then eventually the PC Juniors. So it was Apple IIs, it was Ataris, it was Commodore PETs, and it was TRS-80s. And then the fifth one that joined it, a couple of years later was the PC Junior. So these two people had close connections to Apple. I was recruited at a conference in Basel, actually, by someone who was a high-up person at Apple, saying, "How would you like to come to Apple and join us in this? I understand you know something quite a bit about education." And that's when I, had to make the decision. I told you, it's kind of like if I looked at, at Warner Communications and its entire empire and its asset stuff versus looking at Apple in 1981, it's called, I made a decision to stay. I think my whole career would have been considerably different had I gone the other direction, but I don't think it would have been anywhere near as creative as it was for those 2 years. So I wouldn't give up these 2 years for anything. It was, it actually connected me to some of the most important people in my life, who I've maintained very, very close connections with for years. Some of whom are no longer alive, unfortunately. Heinz and Dean are no longer with us, but a lot of the grantees, who we gave things to have become lifelong friends of mine and colleagues, and I still maintain a lot of connections with them.
I think this will be my last question. If you could send a message to the Atari community, some of which were kids back in the day who were using machines that you donated in buses and vans and science museums, send a message to the remaining Atari users who are still using those machines, what would you tell them?
Well, they may or may not still be using the machines, but they'll all agree that they were probably an interesting part of their life. I would say thank you to them, as opposed to having them thank me, because many of whom have done that already, just because I got more out of the joy of seeing how incredible, this kind of enabling technology could be for people as a creative tool. I mean, I always felt the thing I learned from Alan Kay more than anything is that I think more than computers being what I would call intelligence amplifiers, is I'd call them creativity amplifiers. And that is, in fact, what gave birth to a whole, the companies like Adobe and other people like this who give these kinds of tools to, to the world to create new things or to create new ways of being, is why I was involved in this. So these people were all pioneers. I mean, I learned that from my time at Xerox PARC, which is to treat young people quite seriously as innovators, and I mean people as young as even, really, really young, but definitely teenagers who I think are undervalued for what they're able to do, because if you assume people will do great things and you simply give them the tools at the right time in a community that supports that, they will. But if you consider that they can't do that until they have enough knowledge and enough background to be able to get from A to B to C, you basically have limited them in a particular way that never allows this stuff to come out. So I think that's the key message we were trying to give people is this is already there. You just need tools and support to enable it. And I'm happy it happened. So.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for this. And yeah, just let me know where this is at. I'll send you my wife's email. I mean, we obviously live in the same house, so you're welcome to talk to her as well. And if I can find, some of these people are now difficult to get a hold of, but some are not. And there's a group of people on this list. In fact, if I grab this chat thing
I
for
would really
myself.
appreciate any help because, I mean, I sometimes email people and having a little introduction to lubricate things can help.
No, it's okay. And it's also, if you tell me, if you actually sent, well, is there an index list on the podcasts of who's actually been interviewed?
I will send it to you. It's on the pod. I'll send it to you. It'll be easier.
Yeah, and that way I won't duplicate it. But there's definitely a group of people here, some of whom you really should talk to, and probably haven't gotten to because this is the way it all works. So.
Right.
Okay.
I'll send you a listen in a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and definitely send me the information on the emulator or the connector thing.
Yeah, I'll send you the connector, but honestly, it won't help you if your floppy drive is bad because you can't read stuff off your floppies.
Yeah, but you may have already digitized some of the stuff. Yeah. Some of the stuff, and I don't know whether you have that archive yourself or not, but I'll bet you other people do.
There's some great archives, and if you have your own data, maybe whatever your dissertation, on floppy disk or whatever, I can move that stuff for you, and then you'll have it.
Unfortunately, I don't. That's the problem. The floppies that I had my dissertation on it. That's a whole story in its own right. I'll give you this as kind of the last apocryphal story because it really happened to me. The night before I was printing the last chapter of my dissertation, it was all being done, on an Atari computer, with some typewriter or electronic printer typewriter that I can't remember. But it was very late at night, and I had read the chapter and knew that there were some typos and some mistakes in it. And it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'll never forget this. I had a floppy that was inside there that had the chapter on it, and then there was a message that says, "Do you want to reformat this floppy?" And I said, "Yes." And then it said, "Are you sure? This is the Atari word processor." And I, being bleary-eyed, I said, "Yes." So at which point, it wiped out the entire contents of what was there. So I filed my dissertation with that chapter with the mistakes that are in it because I had no choice. I wasn't going to be able to retype the entire thing by the following day. So to this day, that chapter is still there the same way it was. And it goes to show that my advisor probably never read the final thing at all because I never got any comments about it. There you go. Okay. Right. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks. You for your time, and nice to meet you. I hope we get a chance to see each other again.
Thanks, Ted. Bye.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.